my name is Ryan New. I'm the instructional lead for Jefferson County Public School. Today we're going to be looking at the question, how do I engage students by engaging in supporting questions? What do questions do in the inquiry process? For us, there are two different types of questions, compelling and supporting. Compelling questions, as you'll remember, are intellectually rigorous and student-friendly, argumentative. They frame units and are oftentimes motivational. Supporting questions are much more specific to disciplinary standards. They're more grounded in the knowns within a discipline, and therefore oftentimes frame lessons so they can become the means to scaffold knowledge over time in order for students to be able to answer the compelling questions. So how do you bring attention to the compelling and supporting question? For us, questions are not ornamental, but are the intellectual drivers of inquiry that ultimately lead students to argument and action. Therefore, there must be time set aside for us to really get into the language and the meaning of those questions. When it comes to compelling questions, we often talk about staging the compelling question. This is done at the very beginning of the unit. So you'll want to create some civic space in order to discuss the question's language and dispositions, to connect it to the lived experiences of the students, and to spark curiosity while building context for the unit. Remember that if a compelling question is for the entire unit, we really need to ground in that question because that's going to be tying together the next several days of learning. Each of those days then are going to be represented by a supporting question. So we talk about engaging the supporting question at the beginning of the class. Therefore, civic space must be provided to focus students on the importance of questions, to focus students in the mindset and to ready them for the sources and tasks that are coming, and ultimately to also to spark curiosity for the lesson. Today we'll be spending much more time on looking at supporting questions. How do supporting question standards scaffold? As you'll see here, supporting questions are germane to the questioning standard that begins every single inquiry. For us, all these are IQ2. You'll notice identify, develop, generate, and so on. That's very important both for teacher and student to do. Teachers might create a supporting question to drive the lesson, but that doesn't mean that other students aren't creating supporting questions during that lesson. What might inquiry look like in a typical class? We've gone through this prior, but the idea is that at the beginning of the class, you're going to be engaging the question. In the middle of the class, now that the question has sort of set the focus and direction, students will engage sources through discussion. Why? So that at the end of the lesson, students will be able to communicate conclusions using those sources to help answer the question. So how might you begin a lesson? Well, engaging supporting questions inside of a lesson typically take around 5 to 8 minutes. Why is this so important? Well, engaging questions legitimizes the question for students. It means that we're going to be pausing for a moment to look at why this question is worthy of study. So choose one of the following options among many, but we're going to talk about 3 today. Those include questioning the question, sparking curiosity with the source, and contextualizing within the compelling question. First, we'll start with questioning the question. In this task, teachers will provide 45 seconds to 60 seconds for students to individually or in groups to list out questions they have about the question they're going to study. Provide another 45 to 60 seconds for students to rank those questions of what they deem most important, i.e., what is the most important question we can ask a supporting question for the lesson for us to better understand what the lesson question is asking. Then provide 60 seconds or so for groups to share out their top questions. This provides teachers with the needed opportunity to A, find out what prior knowledge students might have, how they are looking at questions, and giving them practice in question asking itself. If needed then, once students are able to share out, teachers are able to address any kind of misconceptions that might arise. When the teacher as facilitator comes into that role, do not worry about addressing all the questions, right? We all don't know which questions are the most worthy of our time, and we've only got so much time. So the idea of prioritizing questions now becomes one of the skills and one of the focal points that we have when doing a lesson. Also, you can Provide opportunities for students' questions when communicating conclusions. If a student has a great question and you feel like the sources or the discussion really merit being able to answer it, then please allow the students to replace the lesson question that you began the day with one of their own or with a peer. In an elementary example for first grade, we have a supporting question: how do people change their community? I did this with my son, who's a first grader, and really I had to break this down for him to look at the three major parts of the question. People, change, community. My son came up with, well, what are their names? Which is a total kid answer. He also said, well, where do these people live? Which is very important to understand which people we're talking about when it comes to the types of communities. Because if you'll notice for community, well, what are the different communities that are there? When it comes to change, he wants to know if the change is going to be good or bad. And then ultimately, his final question is, well, why do we change to begin with? And all these are legitimate questions that students should have around a question about how do people change their community. I also have a fifth grader, and we were looking at the question, how did Bacon's Rebellion shift the colonies towards race-based enslavement? These are the questions that my fifth grader posed to me whenever I gave her the task of trying to come up with what are the types of questions that you might ask to better understand this larger question. As you can see, these are fantastic questions by a 10-year-old, and some that merit more discovery. Some of these will be answered during the lesson. If they're going to be answered during the lesson, then just say, you know what, you guys are fantastic. You guys are already thinking way ahead of where we're going to be going inside the lesson. If they are not, now a teacher has to make a choice whether or not those questions are worthy of more time inside of a class. Taking a look at a middle school example, how did trans-Saharan trade lead to West African wealth and success? You can see here that there's a lot of different types of questions that we might want to pose first and foremost before diving in and accepting this kind of question. It allows us as a group of students inside of a civic space to make sense of the language and develop a common language through which we're going to investigate the question. For high school, looking at the question, how does housing reveal economic inequities in Louisville? Again, you can see the variety of questions that we might go into to discuss everything from housing costs, the types of jobs, to where transportation exists, to how dense the population is. These are very rich questions which merit breaking them down. And there might be a panic moment where you say there's too many questions, and you're absolutely right. We have to prioritize which questions are the most worthy of our and our students' time. So this is just one way of beginning your class that does not take that much time, but provides enormous amounts of feedback, both for the question and the types of understanding that your students bring to the table and want to bring to the table, while giving them an opportunity to ask questions themselves. The second type is sparking curiosity with a source. For this, we're going to use a very specific strategy called Visual Thinking Strategies, VTS. In this task, you'll choose a source that might spark curiosity for the supporting question. Then, in your whole group, describe what's going on. And these are students, by the way, describing. Then, only after they describe those merits, can analysis of the source begin. Some of our students, right, are real quick with being able to try to analyze immediately. But until students are able to slow themselves down with describing everything that's there, their analysis may be incomplete. We want to make sure that we provide space for all of our students to be able to really take in what the source is giving them before they start analysis. The questions to ask during VTS are just these three, and you're going to ask them a lot. What's going on in the source? What do you see that makes you say that? What more can you find? These are going to be questions that you continue to prompt students with as you're using these questions to spur their description, to spur their analysis. So when it comes to you as a facilitator, make sure that you paraphrase each student's response. That way you really honor what the student is saying. Don't try to change what the student said. Really try to figure out what is at the heart of what's going on. This really honors what that student is bringing, right, to the table. Point to details when your students mention them. Make them prove, right? Either yourself or another classmate, make them prove where it is that another student is mentioning, right? By pointing to those details so that everybody can see the same thing. That will help elicit a lot more conversation. You might disagree with students, and some of the responses might not be logical. That's okay. That will work itself out as students begin to talk and analyze what's going on. We have to put everything on the table, even some of the bad ideas. But ultimately, right, before you transition to something else, you as a teacher will have the say in being able to clear up any kind of misconceptions. With that said, don't be tempted to try to summarize or to review everything that was said by the students. This is a very powerful and empowering process, and oftentimes that summation and review is not needed because of how in-depth you'll go with the students. A few examples here. An elementary example. Let's say we begin this question, why do things we use come from different countries? With this source, we might ask students, what's going on here? After several responses, what makes you say that? Make them use evidence that they're seeing. Make them point to the photo of where they are getting their description. And then finally, the third question, what more can you find? Which prompts further inquiry. For a 7th grade example, how did the physical environment impact trade in West Africa? Again, a source here using to try to spark curiosity. What's going on? What makes you say that? And what more can you find? Again, your role here as a facilitator is to pull out from student conversation while not trying to over-explain what's happening. Let them try to figure it out. And finally, as a high school example, how did organizations of the civil rights movement achieve their goals? You might say, what's going on? Looks like people are blowing smoke in somebody else's face. What makes you say that? 2 people are on either side of another individual and they're all blowing smoke in the person's face, right? What more can you find out, right? Or what more can you find? These are the types of questions that are leading to this so that ultimately we're able to use a question or a source like this to really spark some curiosity so that folks understand, at least in this source, that part of the reason why nonviolent protests were so powerful is that they actually put themselves through some of the violence in order to better prepare for it. The third way is contextualizing with a compelling question. Contextualizing within the compelling question can be done in a couple ways. The first is to provide 60 to 90 seconds for students to individually or in groups to make connections between the lesson supporting question of that day and the unit compelling question that you've been studying. Because ultimately, remember, it is supporting questions being scaffolded over time that builds the knowledge for students to be able to answer the compelling question. So in this case, we're just stopping for a moment and saying, what do you anticipate is going on? You could also use yesterday's supporting question at the beginning of the class so that it helps frame where we are in our learning for the compelling question. Contextualizing within the compelling question is really about where are we in the terms of our learning when it comes to building our knowledge towards the compelling question. Therefore, maybe you don't want to look at the compelling question. Maybe it's still too fuzzy. Maybe it's earlier on in the unit. Therefore, provide students with 90 to 120 seconds, right? 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes for students to make connections between previous and future supporting questions. That way they're able to see a clear, linear thinking of the types of questions that are building knowledge to the compelling question. Then you share out in whole group for however long you'd like. Teacher as facilitator, you could build with just the previous or the next question, right? So this is a modification. Maybe you look at just yesterday's question and today's question. Maybe you took a look at today's question and reference it to tomorrow's question. It doesn't have to be across multiple questions. You could just start small. Teachers can also use this as an ongoing formal assessment to determine how students are progressing as you move along. If they're able to recall and apply what they've been talking about in the previous supporting questions, that should give the teacher and the student confidence that their learning is progressing in the right way. So let's take a look at a few examples. Let's say that in an elementary example, how do you make a government responsible? And the supporting question, what are the powers and responsibilities of the judicial branch? You're probably already anticipating which question came before and which questions comes after. But first, let's take a look at how this question relates to the larger question. How do you make a government responsible? Maybe individuals could be talking about, well, what is the judicial branch? What is its purpose inside of a government? And oftentimes this is from prior experience or from prior learning. Again, you're just taking a moment to pause and make a connection from one question to a much larger question. Maybe you want to do this with the compelling question. Maybe you want to do it with just looking at the other supporting questions. So here we have our question for the day. What are the powers and responsibilities of the judicial branch? But that it's sandwiched between, what are the powers and responsibilities of the executive branch? And number 9, how do checks and balances ensure government is responsible? Imagine giving students the opportunity to say, what is our thinking when it comes to this? What are we seeing as a connection? As you can probably tell, right, the question before supporting question number 7 was, what are the powers and responsibilities of the legislative branch? Right? So you're trying to figure out what is this larger thinking that students are doing over time. Right? Making connections before, making connections after. Let's take a look at a middle school example. How did racist policies divide the country? If we're looking at how did enslavers use the government to their advantage, we can make a connection to the larger idea about how enslavers are using the government, right, to their advantage, which means they're probably creating racist policies that will divide a state or divide an area or ultimately divide the country, depending on which level of government you're referring to. Well, how does enslavers using the government to their advantage apply to the previous question we just looked at about popular sovereignty in the Kansas-Nebraska Act and how that led to division, right? Again, our students are trying to do anticipatory, predictive thinking during this exercise. Or ultimately, how do you think today's lesson about enslavers using the government to their advantage is going to relate to how new political parties address the division in the United States? We can probably make some educated guesses about where the enslavers are in some of those parties. With our high school example, how did the Industrial Revolution negatively impact the environment? What would students be able to say when it comes to development meaning progress? What would they be wrestling with when it comes to looking at the Industrial Revolution and what was talked about previously and its connections to the environment? Additionally, we could look at what was going on before. How did traditional agricultural societies change because of the Industrial Revolution? And what connection does that have then when it comes to the environment? Or we could be looking forward. How did the Industrial Revolution negatively impact the environment? How did the Industrial Revolution reshape hierarchies in society? Now we're sort of seeing the long reach of the Industrial Revolution just by looking at the questions themselves. Finally then, how do we bring attention to the compelling and supporting question? This is where we began our day, looking at the idea that our questions are not ornamental, that they are the engines that drive our thinking, but sometimes we have to begin that thinking immediately by engaging the supporting question when it comes to supporting questions, or staging the compelling question when it comes to compelling questions. That's why it's so important to begin every inquiry with something that's going to get students' attentions where they can get buy-in and have their voice immediately when the class begins. Why this matters is because, remember, our goal in social studies is to build democratic classrooms, and that part of our disposition is making space for students to be able to share their voices and have greater agency as they begin an inquiry process so that they can move towards creating arguments and action. Thank you. And this has been How Do I Engage Students by Engaging in the Supporting Question. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out.